Hey everybody, Qroo here. Welcome to the channel. The other day I did a video talking about the importance of learning Spanish verbs with their prepositions. Folks seem to like that video, so I thought I'd do another one today. Knowing which verbs in Spanish require a preposition can be tricky because it may not translate literally from the English. For example, let's take a look at the Spanish verb for to survive. Sobrevivir, sobrevivir. When you want to say that you survived something, you need to include a little a, that preposition a. Sobrevivimos a la tormenta. We survived the storm. In English, that would literally be like, we survived to the storm. And since we don't say that in English, we need to go ahead and put that preposition on our word list when we list the verb. So on my word list back in the day when I had them, I would have sobrevivir a, to survive something. The majority of the time, you're going to have to learn these verbs that take an unexpected preposition one at a time. They don't tend to lump into certain categories, but there are some exceptions. And we're going to start with those today. That might help you. So our first category is going to be verbs of learning or teaching. Our verbs in this category are enseñar, to teach, and aprender, to learn. These are going to take the preposition a when they're followed by another verb. So think of it as enseñar a plus infinitive, to teach to do something, aprender a plus infinitive, to learn to do something. Here's an example. Mi amigo me enseñó a preparar platos deliciosos. My friend taught me how to prepare delicious dishes. Quiero aprender a hablar español. I want to learn how to speak Spanish. Now when I said that, you have that a right after aprender and hablar right next to it, and since H is silent, it may have sounded like they kind of melded, and they probably did. But when you're writing it, you want to make sure that you have that a in there. This pattern of adding the preposition a after enseñar and aprender only applies when you're using another verb, not a noun. Quiero aprender español. I want to learn Spanish. Esa profesora enseña matemáticas. That professor or that teacher teaches math. To keep that clear on my own word list, I may actually have multiple entries for the same verb. For example, I might have aprender, to learn. And the next entry might be aprender a plus infinitive, to learn how to do something. Same thing with enseñar. Enseñar, to teach. Enseñar a plus infinitive, to teach to do something. These are just things that helped me back in the day. All right, let's talk about some other categories of verbs that follow the same pattern. I love patterns. I think that learning a language is all about learning patterns and then being able to repeat them. So, when we can kind of cluster things together to help us remember, I love that. All right, our next category is going to be verbs of beginning. These are going to work like aprender and enseñar. If they're followed by a verb, you're going to have an a in there. If not, no a. Our verbs in this category are empezar, to begin, comenzar, to begin, and ponerse a, to begin. That last one, the ponerse a, you may not be too familiar with, so I'm going to start with empezar and comenzar. When do you want to start studying Spanish? ¿Cuándo quieres empezar a estudiar español? Or ¿cuándo quieres comenzar a estudiar español? When it comes to empezar or comenzar, there's really no difference, whichever one you prefer. So we have our preposition a in there after empezar and comenzar because there's a verb. If we had a noun, no a. Are you ready to start the project? ¿Estás listo para empezar el proyecto? ¿Estás listo para empezar el proyecto? No a. Now let's go ahead and talk about ponerse a. This is really common in Spanish, but it's not something I hear a lot of people who are learning Spanish use. I put it on my word list just like this. Ponerse a is like to begin to do something or set out to do something. Here's an example. María sacó su cuaderno y se puso a estudiar para el examen. Maria took out her notebook and started to study for the exam. Ponerse a plus the infinitive is really common when we're talking about emotions. Al escuchar la noticia, nos pusimos a llorar. Upon hearing the news, we started to cry. I just want to point out that little al right before the verb escuchar. That is a great way to say when I did something or upon doing something without having to conjugate the verb. Al plus infinitive. It's a really useful one. You might want to add that to your word list if it's not already there. When we're talking about verbs that require that preposition a after them before you name another verb, Another big category for this is going to be our verbs of motion. They're always going to have that a after the verb of motion before the next verb, and often without that verb if the meaning of a is to, right? Voy a la tienda. I go to the store. The verbs of motion we'll be looking at in this category are ir, to go, venir, to come, volver, to return. One thing you have to keep in mind with this particular category is that when we make these constructions with our a and another verb, it may actually change the meaning of the sentence. Let's start with ir, to go. It's going to be ir, a, plus the infinitive. Now, in Spanish, this is often used, just like it is in English, to express the future. Voy a estudiar. I'm going to study. Voy a cocinar. I'm going to cook. Now let's look at venir a plus infinitive. To come to do something, okay? This is going to be similar to English. There's no special meaning here or anything. Juan came to tell me what happened yesterday. Juan vino a contarme lo que sucedió ayer. Juan vino a contarme lo que sucedió ayer. Last one on that list is volver, to return, a plus infinitive. Now, when we use it in this construction, it means to do something again. So the meaning changed quite a bit. This is super common and super useful in Spanish. If you're not already using it, definitely highlight this one. Volver, a plus infinitive, to do something again. You should paint the house again. Deberías volver a pintar la casa. Deberías volver a pintar la casa. I don't want to see her again. No quiero volver a verla. No quiero volver a verla. Another verb that I find really useful that could be in this category is acercarse, to get closer. And we use it just like we would in English. You can get emotionally closer with somebody or physically closer. ¿Quieres acercarte a la pantalla? Do you want to get closer to the screen? Now, if you just want to say get closer or come closer, you can do this without the a. You can just use the imperative or the command form. Acércate. Acércate. It means get closer. If you want to specify to get closer to what, you're going to have to pop in that a. Acércate a mí. Get closer to me. Acércate a tu abuela. Get closer to your grandmother. So those are just some categories that might help you remember when to plug in that preposition a. It was nice to be able to lump them all together like that, right? As I mentioned, for the most part, you're not going to be able to do that. Things don't fall into categories. Those are unique. You're going to have to learn these words basically one at a time with the preposition. So why don't we go ahead and do that now? I'm going to go through some of the more common ones that I use because I want to give you vocabulary words that are, well, actually useful, that you're going to be working into your Spanish. And we're going to be starting with acostumbrarse a. Acostumbrarse a. And that is to get used to something or to get accustomed to something. We're going to be using it with nouns and verbs. Hay que acostumbrarse al calor. One has to get used to the heat. You'll see that was al because the a and the el with el calor join to become al. Many Spanish verbs can be converted into adjectives by using the ado ending for AR verbs and the IDO ending for ER and IR verbs. Acostumbrar is one of those verbs. Now, when we use this as an adjective, we are still going to be using the same prepositions. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Estoy acostumbrado al calor. I'm used to the heat. I'm accustomed to the heat. Remember that adjectives in Spanish always agree in number and gender with the word they're modifying. María está acostumbrada a trabajar todos los días. Maria's used to working every day. She's accustomed to working every day. So with that one, it's acostumbrada because Maria's a female. We still have our a preposition in there and then our verb. It's not that tough, right? Next one on our list is asistir a. To attend something, like to go to something. Quiero asistir al evento. I want to attend the event. One common mistake that I hear people who are learning Spanish make with that particular construction is they try to use another Spanish verb instead of asistir. They try to use atender because, well, it sounds like English, right? Attend something, atender. That type of atender is different. That's used for like looking after people or taking care of people. It's also like, let's say if you go to a restaurant, that's what the waiter's doing. You know, they're attending to you. El mesero nos atendió muy bien. The waiter did a great job. He attended to us well. He looked after us well. Since this is such a common mistake, you might want to go ahead and list these two verbs together on your word list, you know, just to keep it clear. Next one on our list is dedicarse a. to dedicate oneself to something. And this is a pretty common way to ask somebody what they do for a living. ¿A qué te dedicas? What do you do? Meaning, what do you do for a living? What do you dedicate yourself to? That one is in the informal, the tú form. If you want to use it in the usted form, just a little tweak there. ¿A qué se dedica? ¿A qué se dedica? What do you dedicate yourself to? Juan se dedica a enseñar a niños a tocar el piano. Juan dedicates himself to teaching children to play the piano. So let's go ahead and take a look at our sentence there. It starts with Juan se dedica. Juan dedicates himself, and we know we need a, so we have our a. Enseñar, to teach. We just learned that enseñar is one of those verbs that requires an a before the infinitive. But with this sentence, it's a little different, right? So we have enseñar a niños. That first a is the personal a, right? Because who's he teaching? Children. Now we want to say, what is he teaching them? To play the piano. That's where that a popped in, right? A tocar el piano. Our next one on our list is one I talked about in another video recently. Parecerse a. To look like or resemble something or someone. Me parezco a mi abuelo. I look like my grandfather. Mi amigo se parece mucho al tipo que acaba de entrar. My friend looks a lot like the guy that just came in. That's another useful construction. If you don't know it, is acabar de plus infinitive means to have just done something. With parecerse, you won't need the a if you don't have an object, if it's just like reciprocal, you know? Los hermanos se parecen. The brothers look alike. But if I said the brothers look like him, it's going to appear again. Los hermanos se parecen a él. I just want to point out too that when we're using él as he, that's the él with an accent over the e, it's not going to join with that a. They're going to stay separate. Los hermanos se parecen a él. Next one on our list is limitarse a, to limit oneself to doing something. Voy a limitarme a comer solo 2 donas al día. I'm going to limit myself to eating only 2 donuts a day. Limitarse is a pretty easy verb to use. It's very similar to English. I don't think you'll have any trouble with that one. Just don't forget that a before any other verbs, all right? So far in this video, I've only been using the preposition a, so let's look at some verbs that use some different prepositions before we call it a day. Abstenerse de, to abstain from doing something or to refrain from doing something. This one is going to conjugate just like the verb tener. Por razones de salud, me abstengo de comer carne de res. For health reasons, I refrain from eating beef. Here's another example with that one. Los testigos deben abstenerse de hablar del caso con la prensa. The witnesses must refrain from talking about the case with the press. With that one, you shouldn't have any trouble remembering the de because it's just like English. Refrain from something, abstain from doing something. But this one, you're gonna have to remember that de, and it is abusar de is to abuse something or someone. Juan abusa de su autoridad. Juan abuses his authority. See that, you wouldn't expect that de to be there, right? It's like Juan abuses of his authority. So if you just put on your word list, abusar de means to abuse something or someone, you shouldn't have any trouble. Next one on our list is quejarse de, to complain about something. Now, some folks will try to say like quejarse sobre, no, quejarse de. Los vecinos siempre se quejan de nuestras fiestas. The neighbors always complain about our parties. Juan se queja de todo. Juan complains about everything. Next one on our list is consistir en, to consist of. See, in Spanish, it's to consist in and not of. So that's why I made the list. Su trabajo consiste en atender a los clientes y resolver sus problemas. See that atender in there? That's the one I mentioned earlier. You just learned how to use that correctly. Now you don't have any trouble with it. This video is already running a little bit long for my taste, so let's just knock out one more before we move on, and that is amenazar con, to threaten to do something. Here's an example. El jefe amenazó con despedir a todos sus empleados. The boss threatened to fire all of the employees, but literally the boss threatened with firing all the employees. El escándalo amenaza con poner fin a su carrera. The scandal threatens to put an end to her career. That example has another useful phrase I like, poner fin a something, to put an end to something. And of course, if you just want to say that somebody threatens somebody with something, like with a weapon, it's going to look just like English. You're still going to be using con, like, el ladrón me amenazó con un cuchillo. The thief threatened me with a knife. That construction's similar to English. You shouldn't have any trouble with it. Just remember, with verbs, you're still going to be using that con. Well, that's it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, if you just do me a favor and give it a thumbs up. And until next time, hasta luego.